We are coming upon the time of year when many people are getting married. It is a time of great celebration and planning, with lots of hopes and dreams. It is also a time when the people around the loving couple wonder whether the betrothed know what they're really getting into. Lots of the comments on past episodes of this podcast question the wisdom of getting married at all. Those comments lament the legal implications of getting married. Divorce rates are at an all-time low, with only about 6% of people getting divorced each year. Still, people should know what they are getting into when they are getting married, and what impact a divorce can have on them. So in this episode of the Ontario Family Law Podcast, I will explain what you should know about family law before getting married. I'm Judge Schuman, a certified specialist in family law in Ontario, and I've been recognized for my concerns over children's law issues, difficult parenting cases, and complex financial matters. I'm also a mediator, arbitrator, and collaborative lawyer. I have a best-selling book, The Guide to the Basics of Ontario Family Law, which is available on the iBookstore, Amazon, Kobo, and in fine bookstores. My book goes over how family law works in detail, before, after, and during a marriage, and explains what to expect at every step along the way. When people come to see me for marriage contracts, I recommend they read it so they fully understand what they are doing when they're getting married and what getting separated means. When people get married young, those around them often say that they don't know what they're getting into. People who get married later in life or are getting married for a second time usually have a better idea of what is involved in getting married. Still, many people are surprised by what the legal implications are to getting married, especially if their prior relationship was a common law relationship, which is very different from being married under the law. There are some things that people really should understand before they get married, so they will know what they're getting into. I often tell people who are coming to me for marriage contracts that it's worthwhile to read my book because they can see the effect of their marriage on what happens when they separate. That gives them some extra detail that helps them plan and organize their lives. For now, in this episode, I will cover some of the most important legal consequences to getting married so that people know what they're getting into before the ceremony. Married spouses share the growth in their assets. When people talk about getting married, one of the things that they think about is sharing everything they own with their new spouse. But marriage in Ontario does not give one spouse a legal right of ownership to the other spouse's things. Under the Family Law Act, married spouses share in the growth of their net worth during the marriage, with some exceptions. And on separation, one spouse makes a payment to the other spouse so that the growth in their net worths are the same from the marriage. As I covered in episode 85, and in greater detail in my book, married spouses do not share everything they own 50-50. It is just the growth in their net worth that they share. There are some important exceptions to that rule. First, married spouses do not share gifts or inheritance from a third party, someone who's not their spouse, unless they mix that gift or inheritance in with their spouse's assets or put it into a matrimonial home. If a spouse inherits $1 million from their parents, then that spouse gets to keep that $1 million plus all the growth of that money, unless that spouse shares the money with the other spouse, usually by putting it into a joint asset or a bank account. If the spouse that inherited the money spends it all, then it does not factor into the calculation at all, because it is gone. If the spouse puts that gift or inheritance into a matrimonial home, either to buy the home or to pay down the mortgage, then that spouse does not get any credit for having inherited the money. But as long as the spouse keeps the inheritance in separate assets that he or she owns alone, then those assets and any increase in value are not shared at all on separation. Damages for personal injury, like pain and suffering payments or payments to provide ongoing treatment after a motor vehicle or other accident, also fall outside of a property division in Ontario. Usually those payments are made to cover the cost of continued care for the injured spouse, and so sharing them would not be fair. Payments for income replacement may be shared in several different ways. It can be important when reaching a settlement to try to divide out what the money was paid for so that some of it can be protected on separation. Matrimonial homes pose a particular problem. Usually when a spouse separates, he or she takes off the value of everything that he or she owned on the date of marriage from his or her current net worth to calculate the difference. It is that difference that is usually shared. But in Ontario, matrimonial homes are different. Spouses may have to share their entire value of a matrimonial home when they separate. I will discuss matrimonial homes in more detail next. There are very few ways to get out of sharing property on a divorce from the way I just described. Some exceptions can be made if the marriage was short, under 5 years, or if there were some sort of other unconscionable circumstances. However, those adjustments are not automatic. You will probably need to have a good family lawyer to be able to successfully deviate from the sharing the growth in your net worth during the marriage 50-50. It is important to understand matrimonial homes when getting married. Matrimonial homes can create several difficulties. Under Ontario law, matrimonial homes are special. The matrimonial home is any home that the spouses ordinarily occupy together as husband and wife on the day that they separated. This means any home they lived in together is a matrimonial home. There can be more than one. In fact, there can be several. A main home, a cottage, a timeshare, another vacation property can all be matrimonial homes and all fall under this rule at the same time. Matrimonial homes are special in at least two ways. First, as I was discussing in the last section of this episode, if a spouse separate while they're living in the same home that one of them owned on the date of marriage, the spouse who brought the home into the marriage gets no credit whatsoever for having brought that house into the marriage. The property division calculation, in which spouses share their net worth, operates as if the matrimonial home had zero value on the date of marriage, even if it had become extremely valuable on the date of separation. That rule still applies if the spouse who owned the matrimonial home on the date of marriage had it fully paid off and there was no mortgage and the spouse had put a lot of money into the home to look after it before the marriage. That spouse loses everything. Without taking legal precautions, it is the entire value of the home that spouses share. However, if the spouses move into a new matrimonial home and stop using the old property as their matrimonial home, even if that is shortly before they separate, the spouse who owned the matrimonial home gets full credit for bringing it into the marriage. That is true even if the spouses moved out of a house they owned into a rental property. As long as they are not ordinarily occupying the original home as husband and wife on the date that they separated, then the spouse who owns the house on the date of marriage gets full credit for bringing it in. It is actually a well-known tactic for a spouse who is planning to separate to move his or her family into a new home so that he or she can get credit for the matrimonial home that he or she brought into the marriage. Sometimes this is even done under the guise of renovating the original home and moving the family into another home while the renovations are completed, or deciding that the original home would be a good income property if rented out. As long as the family is not living in that original home on the date of separation, the spouse who brought the house into the marriage gets the full financial credit for bringing it into the marriage. That can be worth an awful lot of money. If you are getting married or separated, it may be very important to make some legal plans to protect yourself. You should get the advice of a good family lawyer who can give advice that's specific to your situation. You can set up an appointment to speak with me by calling 647-342-6775 or emailing me at john@schumanlaw.ca. The second big way that matrimonial homes are important is that one married spouse cannot force the other married spouse out of a matrimonial home. Common law spouses can. On separation, both married spouses have a legal right to stay in the matrimonial home, no matter who owns it, until the parties agree or a judge orders otherwise. In episode 91, I covered the legal considerations surrounding moving out of a matrimonial home. Doing the wrong thing can have serious consequences, so check out that episode. And check out my book to understand better. To keep a spouse from doing devious things to force their estranged spouse out of a matrimonial home, the law places several other restrictions on matrimonial homes. One married spouse cannot sell a matrimonial home without the other spouse's permission, even after separation. This means that a spouse cannot sell a matrimonial home to force the other spouse out. In addition, a married spouse cannot put a new mortgage or remortgage the matrimonial home without the other spouse's permission, even during the marriage. This prevents one spouse from taking all the equity out of the house and walking away, leaving the remaining spouse to be forced out when the bank forecloses on the mortgage. These restrictions can cause a lot of problems during a marriage and after separation. They can also cause problems in situations of domestic violence where one spouse cannot legally force the other one out of the house going to court or having the police lay charges. That hurdle can make escape difficult. There are other ways to limit some of the impacts of a house being a matrimonial home. One way is by putting a matrimonial home designation on title, for which you need to speak to a lawyer. Another way is with a marriage contract. I went over marriage contracts in detail in episode 63. Check out the episode, but to make the best plans for your marriage and possible separation, you should speak to a lawyer to get advice that's specific to your situation. I know it may not sound romantic to talk about marriage contracts before a wedding. However, family lawyers find that spouses who get marriage contracts and spend time thinking about what marriage really means often have more successful marriages and never use that marriage contract in the end. If you'd like to discuss the possibility of a marriage contract with me, call 647-342-6775 or email me at john@schumanlaw.ca. Spousal support. Spousal support is money paid by one spouse, the other spouse, to support that other spouse, not the children. It is often based on the differences of income between the two spouses in separation. Spousal support can be much more than child support. In fact, spousal support can be a lot of money, perhaps even half of what one spouse earns. Common law spouses are not liable for spousal support to each other until they have been living together for 3 years, or they are the natural or adoptive parents of a child. However, married spouses can be liable for spousal support to each other as soon as they get married. Even spouses who have only been married for a few days can have to pay a lot for spousal support, especially where one spouse has given up a lot or become reliant on the other spouse financially. That can be the case where one spouse comes to join the other spouse to get married in Canada, and then the spouses separate shortly afterward. In episode 55, I went over whether those spouses can then get divorced in Canada. But there are other circumstances that can lead to spousal support after even short marriages, especially when there are children. Spousal support is a complex topic, and I cannot go over it in detail in this episode. However, my book does explain spousal support in greater detail, including some of the big mistakes that people make that result in them paying too much or too little support. Talking about big divorce mistakes, check out the Divorce Mistakes playlist in this podcast. One of those episodes on these types of mistakes is episode 90. There are a lot more legal tips and good strategies for family court, family arbitration, and even mediation and negotiation in the more than 100 episodes of this podcast. So please subscribe. Hit the like button so other people in similar situations will get this advice, and ring the notification bell so that you know as soon as new episodes come out. You may also want to pick up a copy of my book. In addition, you can get a lot more Ontario family law information on www.schumanlaw.ca and on my social media feeds. Check out my Facebook page, follow me on Twitter and Mastodon at @SchumanFamLaw, and find me on LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Threads. Child support. Yes, there are dangers for child support when you get married. And I'm not just talking about child support for your own kids with your new spouse. Biological parents pay child support when they separate. However, if you are marrying someone who already has children, then you must be very careful. It is not just biological parents or adoptive parents that must pay child support. Anyone who stands in the place of a parent must pay child support. So a spouse can end up paying child support for kids that are not his or hers. This does happen all the time. Just because two people move in together does not mean that they will both be liable for child support of the kids who live in that home. To be liable for child support, a spouse who is not a biological or adoptive parent of the children must treat those children like they were his or her own. That spouse must act like a parent. If that spouse does not act like a parent, but acts more like a friend or just a partner to the child's parent without getting involved in parenting, then that spouse is not liable for child support. It can often be difficult to determine how much a person has actually acted like a parent. When people get married, they're expressing a significant commitment to each other. That commitment can be much more than just living common law. Two people who are married are not just living together in the same house, nor is one of those spouses just sleeping over or just acting like a boyfriend or girlfriend. By getting married, those spouses are indicating that they are committed to their family. That can include being committed to each other's children as well. It is much easier to find that a married spouse acts like a parent than a non-married spouse who tried very hard to make it clear that he or she was not a parent to those kids. In a marriage, it is much harder to say that you are committed to your spouse, but not the kids who live in the family as well. That can lead to child support obligations. Also, you cannot opt out of child support through a marriage contract. When you get married to a person who already has children, you can be liable for child support unless it is clear you did not act like a parent to those kids. That can mean going to great lengths to make absolutely clear that you are not a parent. You are not a second mother or second father. You do not engage in discipline or make important decisions for the children. You might be able to act like a babysitter, but that is as far as you can go. And in families with children, it may be very difficult to separate the obligations of being married from the obligations of getting those children to their activities or to school or otherwise helping your married spouse out with his or her responsibilities. Being married is about sharing those types of responsibilities, but not if you want to avoid paying child support on separation. This can be a very difficult line to walk. If you find yourself in this situation, then you may want to speak with a good family lawyer before you get married so that you know what kind of conversations you must have with your spouse before the wedding. After the wedding, those conversations may be more difficult, and it may be even more important to speak to a lawyer about what you should say and do if you find yourself on the wrong end of a child support order. Again, you can contact me by calling 647-342-6775 or emailing john@schumanlaw.ca. Being married means you cannot have another husband or wife, but doesn't prevent you from having another spouse. In Canada, people can only be married to one person. A marriage is between two people. There are no exceptions to this. Marrying more than one person at the same time can only invalidate the second marriage, but it can be a criminal offense. However, note that if the second husband or wife did not know that the first husband or wife was already married, then that spouse thought that he or she was getting legally married. When a spouse believes he or she is getting legally married, he or she can ask for support or property division even if that marriage turns out to be legally void. That's just one way a married spouse can have more than one spouse for family law purposes. It is also possible to have a common law spouse and a married spouse at the same time. This often happens when spouses separate and don't get divorced and one of those spouses moves in with somebody else. In that situation, the unlucky spouse can have obligations to both the married spouse and the new common law spouse at the same time. Often, after a first relationship has failed, people get advice from a family lawyer before starting a second relationship. Doing so can save a lot of money and heartache. It is a wise move to know the additional complications that those second relationships can bring. If you don't want to speak to a family lawyer, you can always get a copy of my book to understand how family law might work in your situation. But to get advice that's specific to your situation, contact me by calling 647-342-6775 or emailing john@schumanlaw.ca. Conclusion. Getting married can have some big legal implications. It can have serious consequences for your assets when it comes to property division. To get more information than I discussed in this video, check out episode 92. Also, being married can lead to some significant spousal and child support obligations. Some of those you can get out of with a marriage contract, and some you cannot. Still, there are ways to protect yourself even in a marriage. It is important to understand what you're legally getting into. Marriages are more important than house or car purchases or other transactions where you enter into legal contracts, sometimes with the advice of a lawyer. If you have money and you are getting married, it's going to be important to speak to a good lawyer to get advice that's specific to your situation. Again, you can email me at john@schumanlaw.ca or call me at 647-342-6775. To get a lot more information on how to succeed in family court and a detailed description of the family court process or important information on parenting matters after separation, and information about child support, spousal support, other financial matters related to separation and divorce, get a copy of my book, The Guide to the Basics of Ontario Family Law. You can access it immediately on the iBookstore and on Amazon for the Kindle version. Amazon can deliver the paperback version directly to your doorstep. Check me out on social media. And please subscribe to my YouTube channel and hit the notification bell to keep up to date. You can get the audio versions of the Ontario Family Law podcast on all major podcast services, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and many more. They are also available at www.schumanlaw.ca. Just look for podcasts in the drop-down menu. Thanks for participating in this podcast. We will get together again soon.